see you. Good to see you, David. Good to see you, everybody. Welcome to the Global Gambit. And this is a late afternoon stream. We're joined here by Professor David Gibbs, a returning guest to the program, to look at what seems to be a very contradictory, perhaps deliberately so, or in my opinion, just because there is no consistency here. Do we have a deal? Or do we not have a deal? That's the question today, after Donald Trump yesterday called off his airstrikes, the intended third day of pressure campaign, as some people call it, now stating just a few hours later that the deal is imminent. Signs or suggestions, reports that the Pakistanis will reactivating, or a few memes I saw on X regarding that sort of the Pakistanis reactivate their peace efforts, and that the Iranians will be visiting Karachi, Islamabad, and so on to get this deal over the line. But in the subsequent hours, just literally the past 2-3 hours, as I've been following this, the Trump administration is now accusing the Iranians of leaking the supposed details of this deal, which, again, just to remind everybody, this is a MOU. It is a Memorandum of Understanding, which means it has no legally binding substance. It is a, hey, we agree to do some stuff. We've just formalized about agreeing to do that stuff instead of just talking about it through tweets and threads. But there's my rather sort of ad hoc opening there, David. What's your assessment of the latest, and of course what we've seen over the past week or few days that have led up to this moment?
I think what you're seeing is that Trump may be recognizing that he has no choice but to capitulate. This would mostly be settled, if it's settled at all, it's going to be settled in Iranian terms, that's my guess. Iran does hold the upper hand here. I think partly because they're willing to endure more punishment than the United States. They see this rightly as an existential issue for them in terms of the existence of their form of government, the Islamic Republic, and also possibly the Iranian state, the possibility the Iranian state could be broken up. There's been some talk about that as a possibility. And so from their standpoint, they're fighting for their lives, and they're willing to go all the way, as far as they have to go, to protect themselves. And so I think they're the ones who are going to make the most strenuous demands here. And again, assuming there is any kind of an agreement, we're talking about an MOU, as you noted. This is a preliminary agreement. In other words, the agreement before the agreement. And there's a whole series of incidents where the United States, under Trump and previous presidents, have broken agreements. The United States has always seen its right to break agreements. There are all sorts of international laws the United States has signed, the United States violates on a regular basis. Trump, of course, has been famous for that, but previous presidents have pretty much done the same thing. Problem the Iranians face is that there has to be, even to settle a war, there has to be some minimal trust with the other party, that when you sign an agreement, they will honor the agreement. And the Iranians have very little basis for that kind of trust, even that minimal trust, given America's record, that the United States and Israel have undertaken 2 wars, both undertaken in the context of negotiations. The last one, of course, involved the decapitation of Iran's leadership, the killing of Iran's top leaders. From the Iranian standpoint, they would have no reason to take seriously anything the United States says. And so they may well have concluded that they're going to settle this in the battlefield, and that any agreement would only be temporary, because that's how it's been in the past. I'm not saying this with any sympathy for the Islamic Republic, because I have no sympathy for the Islamic Republic. I'm just looking at it from their point of view. And from their point of view, I think that's how they would see it. So the question would be, would Trump be willing to to settle the war on terms that are likely to be very humiliating for him and be perceived as a defeat for the United States? Because that really is the only way this war is going to end, if it ends at all.
Yeah, I mean, look, I appreciate you being measured in that, because I think some people hear you being critical, not you, but one being critical of one side, and then they're like, oh, okay, so you fully support the other side. There's a deliberate intention to make things very binary in geopolitics, which I find very lazy and intellectually dishonest.
Yes.
But in this regard, the Islamic Republic is one of the most deplorable regime systems in modern history, and the way that they treat their own people is beyond reprehensible. But we cannot deny that, at least in this specific context, the inconsistency, the unpredictability, the seeming unwillingness of Trump to pick a lane, if you like, and stick with it is the real problem here. So, to me, what do you think is going on in Trump's head in this case? What is he can't make up his mind? He doesn't want to commit because he feels it's still going to be seen as a loss, or is it he literally is just out of his depth?
Well, he clearly is out of his depth. I don't think he really has any appreciation for foreign policy. He doesn't really have the stamina or the ability to really think strategically. He's very impulsive. It does seem to me like he's the phrase between a rock and a hard place, in the sense that he got into this war expecting a quick victory. The Israelis assured him that they'll be able to decapitate the Iranian leadership, or they would do that successfully, and the regime would crumble, and he'd have an easy victory. It'd be just like Venezuela for him, another win, an easy win. And Trump believed that, against the advice of his own intelligence services. The first part of that, of course, worked. The Israelis did decapitate the leadership, but the Iranians evidently were far more capable than he realized, and they'd planned for that kind of decapitation, and they were able to survive that decapitation. And now he's faced with the fact that, on the one hand, he can't win this war, and if he stays in it much longer, it's going to cause a major economic downturn. I think there's a good chance it's going to do that anyway. Even if we end today, it may do that. But there's a much greater economic risk if he continues the war, possibly a very severe economic downturn. Who knows? Maybe something like the 1930s even. He has to be aware of that danger. And so I think he's eager to get out on that account. On the other hand, any exit he makes from this war will have to be considered a defeat for him, because the whole idea is he was going to go to war and change the government in Iran. And Iran is going to emerge from this war, by almost any standard, more powerful than before, because it will always have the possibility of closing the Strait of Hormuz. That Pandora's box has been opened, and once you open Pandora's box, you can't close it again. And so he's facing the prospect of either economic catastrophe with no prospect of success, military success, or acknowledging military defeat and humiliation, including personal humiliation. Those are his choices. If I were him, I would choose the latter, because that's a safer option, the less destructive option, including less destructive from his point of view. But it's a very bad option. There are no good options from his standpoint. And so I think those are the set of choices he's facing. And we'll see what he does. I'm sorry, I can't hear you, Pyotr. I think there's some problem at your end here.
Yeah. I'm on mute. I put myself on mute sometimes because there's a little bit of noise. But no, I mean, what I'm simply saying is, how many times can we go round and round in this merry-go-round? It just seems to me, will the Iranians at one point just get fed up and be like, look, we're done? I mean, part of the reason that this whole escalation happened, this violence occurred, was because they made it very clear that Lebanon is a red line for them. Now, the discussions over the Strait of Hormuz and the nuclear enrichment is just that. They are the terms that will be discussed later on from the MOU. But Lebanon is not something that's ever really been up for discussion, and as far as I can tell, is an absolute predeterminant for any progress to be made. What's your thoughts on that? Do you think that? Well, actually, I'll just expand on that just simply by saying that the Iranians, for the first time, really acted on behalf of a third party, which is a complete shift away from their standard foreign policy. I think this was a piece Trita Parsi of the Quincy Institute wrote, who we have on the show quite often. He made in a separate piece, which sort of expanded on what I was thinking already. So I don't know. Take me through your thoughts on that element.
Well, one thing about Iran is that they're very repressive internally. That's true, but they've never really shown that much inclination towards military aggression. And so what I see is that Hezbollah is their forward line of defense. That's how they regard Hezbollah. And you're right, they haven't, at this point, brought as a condition for ending the war a third party in, which is Israel's conduct in Lebanon. They hadn't made that a condition previously. I think what it reflects is Iran showing greater confidence. They're much more confident in their position than they were before. And so they're making strenuous demands, including demands not only with regard to them, but also with regard to their ally, Hezbollah, and with regard to the sovereignty of Lebanon. And no doubt they're presenting themselves, I think, with some success. In the first place is Goliath against David. And no matter what you may think of the Islamic Republic, there's always a human tendency to give some small cheer to David in this situation. Excuse me, they're David. I said they were Goliath. The United States is Goliath, clearly, and they're David. And there's no doubt about that. And that's how it looks to the public worldwide, including people who don't like them. And so I think basically they're playing on that fact. They're on the verge of defeating Goliath. And so they are willing to basically go further than they have before in terms of one condition now is Israel cease its military activity in Lebanon. One big question here is, can the United States restrain Israel? Is it willing to restrain Israel, first of all? And second of all, even if it's willing, is it able to do so? That could be a deal killer from the standpoint of the Iranians, and that could be a major impediment to settling this war.
Yeah, well, let's be honest, the trigger, and what I find interesting, David, is that regardless of who you're speaking to, we try to be diversified in who we interview or engage on the platform. And I've spoken to everyone from Americans to British to Iranians to whatever, everything. But it seems to me it's difficult to find pro-Israeli voices willing to be challenged. Now, don't get me wrong, that's not a critique of the entire state. It's not a critique of everybody who is sort of sympathetic to Israel's position. But I just find it difficult for them to be willing to talk about it. There seems to be a slight reluctance like that because they don't. There is a recognition, to your point, that some people have a sympathy for the David character, or Iran in this case. But all of this largely comes down to the ultra-nationalist government's desires to conduct military operations in Lebanon, which is a red line for the Iranians, and that trickles down to launching exchanges with the Americans, etc., etc. So how does one rein in the Israeli government, or Netanyahu specifically?
Well, the U.S. has definite leverage, and the leverage is financial support, all right, political support and military support, which the United States has been giving to Israel on a pretty massive scale since the early 1970s. It began under Nixon, where the United States would, on a permanent basis, give Israel substantial subsidies to the tune of several $1 billion a year, and more in times of emergency, like in the recent war, and other types of support as well, such as support in the Security Council of the UN, etc. So the U.S. definitely has some leverage over Israel. Israel would not be able to conduct itself with the degree of aggressiveness and expansiveness if they did not have the United States backstopping them. If we're on its own, it would not act the way it's acting. And so what the United States could do is it could simply condition U.S. support on Israel acting differently. And, for example, withdrawing from Lebanon, or at least ceasing any further move in Lebanon. They could do that. A better move, in my view, would simply cutting them off from military support and economic support and treating them at arm's length like any other country. That's another option. As everyone knows, Israel has a lot of influence in the United States. Part of it is indeed the Israel lobby, described accurately, I would say, in the book, The Israel Lobby by Mearsheimer and Walt, two distinguished academics. I think it's deeper than that. As I've said in other programs, as I would see it, the U.S. foreign policy establishment, especially the element of it known as the neoconservatives, have long seen Israel as a model of what America should be like. And they see Israel as showing the way for how America should conduct itself in foreign affairs. This gives Israel this ideological admiration for Israel, gives Israel an enormous prestige in Washington, in power circles. And I think that's a big source of Israel's influence as well. You have almost the melding of Israel and the United States at the ideological level through neoconservatism. And whatever the cause, there's no doubt Israel does have a lot of influence over American foreign policy. And this is declining because public support for Israel is declining. Public opinion polls are very clear on this. It's declining not only among Democrats, but among Republicans. Very striking decline, by the way, has been among evangelical Christians, along a rock-hard base of support for Israel, very large in the US population. The US is a very religious country, and evangelicalism is very influential. And until now, it has been rock solid in its support for Israel. And that rock solid character is cracking, and younger evangelicals are not so supportive of Israel anymore. I think part of it is very simple. Everybody, including evangelicals, can see the videos of civilians being killed by the Israelis all over the Middle East, particularly in Gaza. And I think that is having an impact. It's having an impact on Israel's support, which is in decline. Israel is down, but not out. And they still have considerable influence in Washington. And Trump evidently has, up till now, not been willing to cross them. I do wonder if the point is being reached, though, where Israel's ability to dictate policy, to influence policy to the extent that it has, is waning. And I think the day may be approaching where the US is going to simply distance itself from Israel. And Israel will be forced by circumstance to act differently.
Really? So you think we're reaching the point of legitimate rupture in the Israeli-American relationship?
Well, I try and avoid wishful thinking. I used to believe in it, but I find it didn't work very well. So I try to swear off wishful thinking. And I could be expressing wishful thinking here. I think the wishful thinking aside, I think that we're definitely seeing some evidence of that happening. And I think it's happening before our eyes. And it's going to be very difficult increasingly for both parties to fully defy their voting bases. I mean, you have elites and then you have masses. We do have elections in America. We still have those things. We still have open discussion to some extent. We have the First Amendment that protects somewhat open discussion. I think more than in Europe, I'm happy to say. And that basically means at some point, it may be more and more difficult for the Israelis to sustain this kind of American backing. One of the reasons the Israeli lobby has been so influential is the public has supported Israel strongly. The public opinion polls showed that over decades. A part of that, of course, is the effectiveness of maybe one might say pro-Israel propaganda, depending on your point of view. But whatever the reason, it's waning. And it's waning to this extent. I think it will have an effect on policy.
So the latest I'm seeing here is that the Trump administration is seething, or Trump is seething at what he considers to be a violation of the talks. He's accused the Iranians of simply saying, oh, wait, actually, no, we've got an update now. The Iranian foreign minister says an agreement with the US has never been closer. Is that coded? Interesting. So we're seeing Iranian foreign minister, the Islamabad MOU has never been closer. Pending its finalization, the media should refrain from, this comes directly from Aragachi in the past half an hour. So, the Islamabad memorandum. Oh, this is a positive sign, everybody. This is quite a big deal. Let me bring this up so that we can all read it. Yeah. So the Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding has never been closer. Pending its finalization, interesting, he uses the American Z. Kidding below. The media should refrain from entering speculation about its content. In line with our responsibility and transparent approach, all details will be shared with the public in due course. Interesting. So Trump doesn't want that for some reason. Clearly. I mean, I'll just sort of share my reaction to that, David, and then obviously you can get yours in as well. But that seems to me like Trump really doesn't want to share the details too much because it's pretty damning for the United States. Would you?
That's how I would see it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's not a favorable condition for the Americans. So what's the tactic here then? The Iranians have always been intending to follow through with this deal, and they're just playing hardball even in the final moments.
I'm sure they're playing hardball. They have every reason to play hardball because I do believe they have the upper hand, and they probably want to nail down as many things as concretely as possible. Again, because there's a strong presumption on their part the United States would do everything they can to walk away from the deal. And they're going to try and make it as hard for the US to do that as possible. And I think Iran would be okay with the idea of the agreement not going through and simply continuing on the battlefield. Because I think in the end, they have every reason to expect they will prevail on the battlefield. The United States will crack before they crack. And so I don't think they'll take any deal that isn't very favorable to them, and the fact that Trump seems so reluctant to share it publicly, at least so far. I think underscores that it's likely to be very unfavorable from his standpoint. I mean, let's face it, the United States went into this war expecting that we were going to get, unconditional surrender. He said he wanted unconditional surrender from the Iranians. Doesn't sound like he's going to get that, does it?
Well, no, he actually wanted a regime change, right? That's
he wanted regime change. At one point, he talked about destroying, Iranian civilization. A charming way to put it.
Civilization erasure, much like
that's right.
happening in Europe.
That's right. And so he's made all sorts of extravagant claims about his intentions. And there's no doubt, at a minimum, the United States wanted regime change, at a minimum, as did Israel. And at a maximum, perhaps, killing everybody in Iran. Certainly he talked that way. Whatever the case, he's not going to get anything like a military victory here. He's going to get something much closer to a military defeat, or at the very least, a settlement that'll favor Iran to a significant extent. Now, I mean, the obvious question is the nuclear issue and to what extent Iran is willing to compromise on that. I'm very surprised that Iran is even willing to discuss the nuclear issue at this point, because from their standpoint, I would have expected they would have made every effort to simply acquire a deployable nuclear weapon as their only real option to defend themselves. Let me say, I think that would be a disaster for world security. And I most definitely don't favor that option, but I'm saying from their point of view, I would have expected them to do that by now, just given they've been attacked multiple times by Israel and the United States. And they may reasonably conclude that the only way they can defend themselves is to acquire deployable nuclear weapons and delivery systems, as North Korea has done. So I'm surprised that they seem to show some flexibility on that issue. We'll see how far they go with it. That could very well be a sticking point, because it could be that Iran has already made a decision they're going to go for a nuclear weapon, and they're simply not going to accept any restrictions on their acquisition of nuclear technology or nuclear material, and that this may be a real problem to a final agreement with the United States. I don't know. We'll see, I suppose. The fact that they're even willing to keep that open as an issue surprises me.
Yeah, so Lindsey Graham said in the past hour as well that the so-called deal, he's very glad to hear that the so-called deal is fake, because the deal as described by Iran would be awful. President Trump and our military deserve a lot of credit for making Iran the weakest they've been since 1979 through a combination of highly effective military strikes and a crushing blockade. However, we must remember the Iranian regime has killed 42,000 of their own people, and their leadership are radical religious Nazis. As to any potential deal, it must be compared to the JCPOA. I'm hopeful that it would be vastly different. The idea of a 300 billion reconstruction fund, given who is in charge of Iran, seems to be tone deaf. It would be akin to the Marshall Plan for Germany with the Nazis still in charge. Goodness me, Lindsey Graham's really even more hell-bent on sort of absolute war and destruction than he has been in the past several years, I think, at this point. How he can seem to sort of think that the US has leverage in this, I don't really understand. I don't know. What do you make of these people when third-party individuals, like, do they have information that we're not privy to, or it's literally just a bluster and trying to jeopardize it from the outside, sort of thing?
I think Lindsey Graham is just engaging in wishful thinking. I think so much of what the United States has been doing, has been based on just on wishful thinking, that the idea is we've decimated Iran's military, we destroyed their air force, destroyed their navy. I think what this obscures is that Iran, clearly what they've invested in is missile technology, most of which is underground, and most of which, not all of it, but most of which has remained intact. That's indeed what U.S. intelligence has shown. And so destroying their tiny navy, and I don't even think we've done that. They still have these speedboats they can use, their submarines that are under, that are highly protected. So I think a lot of this is just wishful thinking and not realizing that Iran is fighting a different kind of war from what we're used to. And that the missile systems are quite formidable, far more than we expected. And there's really nothing we can do about it by all indications. And, I think Lindsey Graham...
I can give you a bit more information, David, if that's cool. No, according to CNN, so this is citing a US official, new details have emerged about this MOU. following Iran's release of their version of the deal. I mean, we've been here before, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, but we've been here before, like in early May, a month ago, 6 weeks ago, when there was a suggested outline of when the MOU first began to be developing speed, and we could actually have some kind of substance to what it would be filled out with. And now we've gone back and forth over the details ever since, right? But like, it seems like we're in this deja vu yet again, where details of the MOU are being disputed. But anyway, but per the US official, the deal includes an Iranian commitment not to fund terror groups abroad, the destruction and removal of the enriched uranium, the dismantling of Iran's wider nuclear program, the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, and the release of frozen Iranian assets and funds contingent on their compliance with the deal.
I'd be very surprised on a number if Iran agreed to a number of those things. In particular, first of all, the nuclear demands. Again, it would be in Iran's interest, as they see it, to have access to at least the possibility of nuclear weapons for self-defense. Again, I don't by any means endorse that. I'm just saying, I would guess that's probably how they would see it. More importantly, I think the Strait of Hormuz, that really is their real nuclear weapon. That is their main source of influence, is the Strait of Hormuz. I think what they would like to do is keep control of the Strait of Hormuz for an extended period of time, several years perhaps, to raise funds to reconstruct their country from the damage that has been done by the two wars. They're not going to get reparations from the United States. That's, as far as I could tell, an impossibility. But short of reparations, of course, they can have their famous toll booth in the Persian Gulf, and they can raise funds that way. That's also just a source of influence for them, to let the United States know that they're not to be trifled with. I'd be very surprised if they give that up under any circumstances, not anytime soon. And from their standpoint, again, I think you can make a strong case that they're entitled to that based upon the need for reconstruction funds. The nuclear issue is, again, I certainly pray and hope that they will not get nuclear weapons, because that would be very bad for world security. But again, from their standpoint, it would not surprise me if that is where they're going with this.
Well, I've got a question on the nuclear element, David, but do you mind if we indulge in watching a 45-second clip of how many times Donald Trump has said a deal is close? Because I think this is beautiful.
We were very close to a deal.
I think it's close to over. Yeah, I mean, I view it as very close to over.
It's looking very good that we're going to make a deal with Iran, and it's going to be a good deal. This process should go very quickly. We're going to end that war very quickly. They want to make a deal so badly. We think we're close to a deal, and that's okay. We're in the final throes of what will be a very, very good deal.
Today makes 39 times.
So CNN reporting there that it's 39 times. I had it written down somewhere. I think I had about 26 times that I've been going through, but I have a life and I wasn't going to go through every piece of media to find the word deal when he said it. But wow, 39 times.
Can I just interject something? I always thought, I mean this sincerely, that one of the main sources of Trump's appeal has been he's very funny. Yeah, you have to admit, when you hear him say again and again that we're close to a deal, there's a certain almost maybe unintended humor in it that's entertaining at a certain level. The problem with it, of course, is this is serious business here, very serious indeed. And it's very hard for Trump to have any credibility about anything, given his past record of verbal indiscipline, which he's famous, of course.
But I find it interesting, David, because you chat with some similar colleagues who have quite differing views, I think, on different parts of the conversation. But somewhere where you've differed, which I think is interesting, and what I wanted to ask you before we watch that very entertaining montage, is over the nuclear element. So we've had Larry Johnson on the program quite a few times, and him and I had a quite blunt back and forth a week or so ago about the propensity for Iran to have a nuclear weapon. Now, according to Larry, he had a source that was unconfirmed, that critical bit, I think there, but still unconfirmed from a source that Iran had nuclear capabilities and would be willing to demonstrate their capacity to use them, not to use them, but to demonstrate them underground. And I was back challenging that. I'm pretty sure that no nation state, including the Russians and the Chinese, would welcome a nuclear capable Iran. And a lot of the audience who are very supportive of Larry or appreciate his perspective, heavily criticized me for that. I didn't like the fact that I was challenging Larry on that point. But then you come and mention just now that you think it would be a very bad idea as well. So I'm kind of interested to, because I think you and Larry have some similar perspectives on things, but on this you clearly diverge. So I'd be very interested to understand your perspective on it.
Well, the problem you have with nuclear weapons, we have 9 nuclear powers now. Iran, if they develop them, would be 10. Is that any time any country has nuclear weapons, there's always, even in the best of times, some small chance they'll be used due to an accident, to a miscalculation, due to who knows what. And that over time, the risk grows. And the more nations that have nuclear weapons, the greater the risk. I personally find it astonishing that we haven't used them in combat since Hiroshima and Nagasaki over 80 years. I find it very unlikely the next 80 years, if we continue this way, we'll continue without nuclear weapons being used in combat. And I find that extremely alarming. And so it's better to have 9 nuclear powers, merely 9, than to have 10 for that reason. Okay. Having 10 increases the risk, okay? It also sets a precedent. If Iran develops nuclear weapons, it could have a cascading effect. You could get other countries in the region, Turkey perhaps, Saudi Arabia developing them. Then in East Asia, you could get several. And in Europe, Germany, Poland, Sweden might develop them independently. All of these things. And the more proliferation we get, the greater the risk to humanity. And let's be very clear, these could wipe out the human race. I'm very concerned about that. One of the things, I'm an older guy. I remember the Cold War, and during the Cold War, people were very constantly frightened. Children, I grew up as a child, frightened of nuclear war. That was very normal. Children were afraid of nuclear war. It was part of the culture. What I find astonishing is that since the end of the Cold War, we've almost lost our fear of nuclear war. There's very little talked about, the extraordinary danger that's posed by this. And so it's on that account that I very definitely would not favor Iran developing a nuclear weapon. Let me make an additional point, though, about nuclear proliferation. Everything the United States has done since the end of the Cold War has been to promote nuclear proliferation. Let me be very clear on this. Muammar Gaddafi in Libya had a nuclear research program that he agreed to give up. I believe it was in 2003, if I'm not mistaken. It was around 2003, early 21st century. He gave up his nuclear research program with a tacit agreement that the United States and Britain would not try and overthrow his government. All right. Well, as we all know, they did overthrow his government, and he was tortured to death. There's even a video somewhere out there of him being tortured to death. And I think many people looked at the Libya case and said Gaddafi was a fool to have trusted the Americans and the British. He would have been much smarter to have developed deployable nuclear weapons, and they never would have overthrown him. He wouldn't have been tortured to death. And other countries will look at that and say, we will not make that mistake. You see, that's an incentive for countries to proliferate, because after all, we don't want to be attacked by the Americans like that. They attack anybody. They attack people at will. And given that fact, given the extraordinary aggressiveness of the United States, and the U.S. is an exceptionally aggressive country, I can go into that, much more so than any other country on the planet, that you need nuclear weapons as the only thing that will protect you. Look at North Korea. North Korea has nuclear weapons, and the Americans leave them alone. And so based on the twin cases, the counterposing of Libya on the one hand, which failed to develop nuclear weapons, and North Korea on the other hand, which did develop nuclear weapons, that's a clear incentive to proliferate. The United States has given every incentive to countries around the world to proliferate. And that is enormously dangerous for international security. I'm surprised it gets so little attention, honestly.
Well, no, I was going to say the same. As I say, we've hosted quite a few different people. We've had a couple of experts on nuclear doctrine from the Balfour Center Managing the Atom at Harvard. We've had a couple from Japan, South Korea, more Western orientated, I guess you'd say. But the common point is that there is a real normalization again of proliferation for nuclear weapons. The public sentiment amongst the Japanese and South Koreans is really growing high, and that's because not only because of the push factor from North Korea, but from the pull factor from Trump as in pulling away and unwillingness to come to their aid, much like we're seeing with Taiwan. We've got an interesting video coming out later today with an expert on Chinese-US relations, everyone, so keep a lookout for that. But it's just, I guess to offer a counterpoint though, David, why should the countries that have nuclear weapons be the ones to hold them? Why can't Iran get one? Why is it not within their right? who can dictate for a sovereign nation whether or not they should have nuclear weapons?
That's certainly how the Iranian, certainly some people in Iran would see it that way. I don't doubt that. And I can see the logic of that. The problem with it is, as I said, this is a threat to the human race, and people underrate that threat, and it's just so obvious. In a matter of just a few minutes, we could see the end of the human race, basically. It is exactly what we're talking about here. And that does not seem worth the risk to me, no. And I don't think it's even a risk. I think over time, if one looks at it dispassionately, it would have to be a probability. Eventually, these weapons will be used if something isn't done. I think, again, that's something that's received remarkably little attention, even though logically, the end result of this has to be nuclear war at some point. I mean, it's astonishing we've gotten this far without that happening. And I can't imagine another 80 years taking place with a nuclear armed world without nuclear weapons being used in combat. That seems an improbable outcome to me. Given that, it'd be better, I think, to move towards some kind of multilateral nuclear disarmament. And there's no effort whatsoever to do that, as far as I can tell. There used to be a large-scale public movement in favor of disarmament with hundreds of thousands of people in the United States, Europe, all over the world. There's nothing like that anymore. It's simply evaporated. And again, I think the lack of interest in this problem, the fundamental nature of this problem, is remarkable to me. You know, we talk about, there's much talk about climate change as an existential threat. I think they're right. I think people who dismiss this are very foolish. But very little discussion of the even greater threat from nuclear weapons. And again, given the alarmist tone I'm adopting, and I think a justifiably alarmist tone, I would view very dimly the idea of any country that is not nuclear now developing nuclear weapons, and that goes for Iran as well. It does not increase security in the long term, it decreases security.
But how can it, though, David, if it's a deterrent? If the Iranians have a nuclear weapon, even if they're not able to launch it, but they can use it as a dirty bomb, is that not enough of a means to be like, leave us alone, America and Israel, stop trying to interfere in our domestic affairs, stop trying to destabilize the entirety of the Middle East, get rid of your bases, give some sovereignty back to our nation states? Yes, okay, we could talk about proxies and Iran's interference, but I'm playing a certain role for this, right? Why would we ever assume as Iranians that that's acceptable?
In the short term, of course, everything you're saying is correct. There's no doubt that that's true. And people who, point to Iran as they'd be smart to develop nuclear weapons, they would make all the arguments you're making, which, as I said, have impeccable logic. The problem with it is the longer term prospect is annihilation of the human race. And to me, that just does not seem worth it. We're talking about, first of all, Iran leading to a new wave of nuclear proliferation with more and more states developing nuclear weapons. Each time that happens, we increase the risk of nuclear war, of the nuclear weapons being used in combat. Each time a new country develops nuclear weapons, it does that, and it encourages still further countries to develop nuclear weapons. And again, I don't see logically how this could go on over a period of time, over a long period of time, without nuclear weapons being used in combat, without nuclear war taking place. And if we get a full-scale nuclear war, that would be the end of civilization. To me, that doesn't seem worth it, no.
Okay, no, that's fair enough. No, that's fair enough. I think that, as I say, a lot of people seem to not give enough weight to what it actually means to get a nuclear weapon or capable.
Exactly. They don't give full weight to what that means. That's absolutely right.
Well, I personally think that, as I say, I don't support the war in Iran at all. I hate the IRGC. I hate the Islamic Republic, but I equally do not think that that they should have a nuclear weapon. Not because I think the Americans and others sort of have the moral right to do so. We should have none of them. But I don't think getting more is the answer. And to pivot this towards something that I've been meaning to get your take on, it's a sort of similar question I've been asking to a few different guests, which is simply, in my perspective, I think that the Iranians have given, the Trump administration have given the Iranians the biggest strategic clarity that they've had in years, in decades even, which is simply, for a long time, the emphasis has been on the nuclear bomb as the nuclear option, right? But actually, what their biggest nuclear option is the Strait of Hormuz, is geography, because they didn't realize even more just how much of a potential pressure point it was. And that's because of the exorbitant privilege and the exorbitant duty that the United States carries as the reserve currency, backbone of the global order. And so I think if the Iranians really wanted to, like in a complete and utter Armageddon kind of sense, like just completely disarray the global economy, because I think they've been restraining themselves a little bit, then they could flip that switch in a similar way that you would be sort of, metaphorically pressing the red button for a nuclear weapon, right? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think what you're saying is a source of optimism for me, because I think you're right that they may view the Strait of Hormuz as their nuclear weapon. Other people have said this, and I think it's absolutely correct, that hopefully they will decide that gives them so much leverage. It gives them so much power and so much, it's such a formidable defense against attack that they don't need actual nuclear weapons if they have this figurative one in the Strait of Hormuz. And so that's the optimistic possibility. The pessimistic possibility is they'll do both. They'll have both the Strait of Hormuz as their nuclear weapon, and they will also develop an actual nuclear weapon they can deploy in combat. I hope I'm wrong about that. And I hope they stick with just the Strait of Hormuz. Because the Strait of Hormuz, I do see an optimistic aspect to this, and that I do see, and I say this as an American citizen, I do see the most destabilizing force in world politics today has been American foreign policy, not just under Trump, but also under the Democrats. The U.S. is a very aggressive country with a very aggressive record. It has a greater record of aggression since 1945, and I include the Cold War, even relative to the Soviet Union, a greater record than any other country in that time frame. And I can give some specific examples if you'd like, but I think the record on this is absolutely clear cut. I mean, other countries have been aggressive, have done very nasty things, including, of course, the Soviets, the Russians, the Iranians, domestically, certainly, have done very bad things. But I think the scale of what the United States has done globally exceeds that of any other country. And the good news here is I think this could be a blow against American hegemony from which it cannot recover. And I think this could be the end of American hegemony. We could be moving towards a multipolar world. And I would see that as there are risks to a multipolar world. Let's be clear about that. But I think the risk is less than continuing with U.S. hegemony. And I think that a multipolar world would be a good thing. And I just see what the United States has done has been so destabilizing. The move into something else would likely be better.
But come on, David, let's be honest. It's preposterous. Multipolarity doesn't work, does it?
That's a theory. If you study it in international relations and political science, as I did, that's what they tell you in the seminars. I think the problem you do have here is that so much of realism is based on what America has done in American conduct, and the natural aggressiveness of countries, I think, mostly references America's record here. If you look at the Soviet Union during the Cold War, mostly I would say they acted defensively. That's my read on it. And mostly when they acted aggressively, it was in response to a U.S. provocation. Look at Cuba. I mean, in Cuba's case, basically, they didn't start giving arms and support to Castro until the United States tried to overthrow the government. They put nuclear missiles in Cuba after the U.S. put nuclear missiles in Turkey on their borders. The whole Cold War was like that. The Soviets were always one step behind the United States. And I think realism likes to portray this as symmetrical. They were both symmetrically aggressive, but I don't think the record shows that at all. I think so much of international relations theory is predicated on a conception of human nature and a conception of how countries act that is based on what America has done since 1945. I think even if one sees that as naive, I think this is the problem here. Well, let me stop for a moment and get your response to that, because I've just included a lot there.
Well, what response to what aspect? Exactly?
Any aspect of what I just said, most of which is very controversial.
I mean, you said a lot there, which I myself have not. How would you summarize? If you could summarize it for me in a point.
Well, that basically that the conception of multipolarity as a bad thing is based on the idea that there's a natural tendency of countries to be aggressive. And if the United States basically withdraws and becomes less aggressive, countries like China and Russia will become more aggressive. And I think that's based upon a view of history that is mostly based upon American aggression. And so much of the idea of the natural tendency of countries to act aggressively is based on the United States, which I think has been uniquely aggressive since 1945. And I think that I think there's an overrating here of the natural tendency of countries to act aggressively, and the assumption that if the United States withdraws, China and Russia will be just as aggressive or more so. I don't think there's very much on the record of evidence to support that.
Look, I think that, well, I was having this conversation with my father just a few days ago because I was catching up with him. He lives outside of the country now, but he's Russian, he's a physicist, and he looks at the world very much in that way, in the role of forces and physics. And he was telling me a story once where he had the opportunity to ask a question to Madeleine Albright in the early 2000s. And this was before the idea of multipolarity really became popular. The US was in its primacy. It was a unipolar world. China was rising. Russia was sort of figuring itself out. But there was no competent power on the same level as the United States. But he was arguing about, what does a bipolar world look like? Or could we lead to multipolarity? It's inherently unstable. And that leads to a greater sort of bottom line, and it's not just him who said that. There's theories out there that have argued that multipolarity in its purest form it does over time gravitate towards a degree of bipolar nature, just because poles are such an important element in power and distribution of power. And what I think maybe makes it slightly difficult to predict now is the role of AI, of advanced technology, what we thought was going to be the never-ending integration and globalization of the world. That's clearly on the reverse. We're shifting towards regions and just an overall fragmentation. So in my mind, I think that whilst you can have multipolarity, I don't know if it's I think it's more likely it's bipolar or tripolar, because it depends. Russia, let's just be blunt, right? What are the poles? It's the United States is the big power, then China is the other major one. Russia could hypothetically be a major power if it wasn't doing its own damage to break, there was that map I think Trump shared before where the US is inherently in charge of the Western Hemisphere, China's in charge of Asia, and then sort of Russia in theory would be managing sort of Europe and that sort of thing. But that's not the case, because Putin has burnt any bridges with Europe at this point, and Russia could have been a great power if it actually invested in itself instead of undertaking foreign wars abroad and inherently destroying the economy and all this sort of stuff. So Putin's effort to sort of glorify and re-establish the Russian state as a major power have clearly not worked. You can't deny Russia.
I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that.
Russia's a big power, but it's a big power because it has nuclear weapons. It has the biggest nuclear arsenal.
I think you're overrating him. I'm sorry. Do you mind if I jump in on that? Is that okay?
No. Just bottom line, in my opinion, great power theory is one of my main areas of focus, ground strategy. And in my opinion, I think that we can talk about multipolarity, but you have to be very specific in what that means. A lot of people associate it with BRICS. We associate it with the global south, but these are nebulous entities which have no clear leader. Modi has tried to represent the global south as a whole, but I think it's pretty clear that there's other nations that don't want India, quote unquote, to be the leader of the global south. And also, to be honest with you, India lacks a lot of potential. It's getting there, but it lacks a lot of things that China and America have, or even Russia to an extent. So I think, bottom line, we can talk about the principle of multipolarity, but when you try to quantify it, I think there's really only two actors in that case: the G2 world, as Trump visit to China. Sorry,
a couple of things is that basically what you're not seeing here, all right, is an arms buildup by Russia or China. Okay, if you look at the key element here is military spending as a percentage of GDP. In China, I believe it's something like 1.7%. With a GDP approximately the same size as the United States, depending on how you measure it, they're spending about half what we're spending on the military. To me, and they have, I think, only one overseas base compared to, 700 to 800 for the United States. There's nothing in that record to suggest they're going to become a global power militarily. There's no military aggression in those numbers. To me, China seems like probably a status quo-oriented country. They do want a sphere of influence, basically, in Southeast Asia, but I think a minimal one, as far as I can tell. I doubt they would go so far as to invade Taiwan. That would be militarily extremely difficult, if not impossible, to do at any kind of reasonable cost for them. Invasions by sea are, by their very nature, extraordinarily difficult, and China has very little experience in that kind of warfare. And the military buildup they're doing is nothing close to what will be necessary for that. I'm just not seeing any obvious aggression in terms of the level of military spending or their overseas presence. Russia, of course, is, well, first of all, I think Russia's economy has actually been doing quite well. You need to look at the data of the IMF. If you look at the IMF data, their economy has been growing. All right, there's nothing suggesting an economic crisis there. I think that is NATO propaganda, and again, easily refuted by looking at the IMF. There's nothing unsustainable about what they're doing in the Ukraine, economically speaking, whatever else you may think of it. What they're not doing, though, is a massive arms buildup. Their military spending as a percentage of GDP, according to the SIPRI figures, I believe is this year 6.5% of GDP, which is about double from what it was 4 years ago before the war started. Again, that's not that huge considering they're fighting a major war. If you look at the model people have of Russia is Germany in the 1930s. We hear that again and again. They're Germany in the 1930s. Germany did a real military buildup. I believe at the time of Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia, I believe military spending, I don't have the figures right in front of me, we're somewhere in the range of 50% of GDP, German GDP. That's a country that's really engaging in aggression globally or regionally, all right? What Russia's doing suggests a much more modest objective, and I don't see any evidence that they have any intention or ability to invade Western Europe. There's also a logical problem here. People are always saying, on the one hand, look at how ineffective Russia is. They can't even subdue a country on their borders, which is true. Look how weak they are. On the other hand, they're going to invade Europe anytime now, and they'll be pushing towards Paris at any moment. This is a logical thinking we're getting here. And so I think there's a tendency to grossly overstate the security threat presented by these two countries. As I would see it, the principal country here is China, not Russia. And everything I'm seeing is they want stability. What they have an interest in is stability. And they're showing nothing to me that I can see that is consistent with the idea of military supremacy or military dominance. And the whole idea here of multipolarity in this threatening way that you're discussing would suggest that China, with this massive military buildup, setting up military bases all over the world, and they're just not doing that or showing really that much interest in doing these things. And so I think people overestimate the security threats that would come if the United States would withdraw from the world. I think that there's at least some possibility of a greater tendency towards non-military resolutions of conflict. I think we have to take that risk just because the United States has been so aggressive and so destabilizing that I think anything that reduces American power in the world would be a positive.
Yeah, look, I mean, we've kind of pivoted away a little bit from the focus of the conversation. I just want to also emphasize that Donald Trump just reshared or reposted Aragachi's post that I had read out about 10 minutes about. So that's a big sign. I think we are genuinely on the cusp of this MOU being pushed through across the line, which would be huzzah. But just on this interesting debate, I'm proud to actually say to people watching that I will be starting a fellowship in the coming few weeks on this kind of thing, on big power plays, grand strategy, world order stuff. And, you know, I think you might have just initiated me to write my first piece of Substack on it as well, David, actually. When is multipolarity not multipolarity? Maybe, do you have a Substack at all? Because I am
no, I'm way too primitive for that.
You should be on there. You'd have such a good engagement, I think, and people would love to read it.
I write books. That's how I communicate with the world. But anyway,
well, you can write books on Substack as well. They just might overload the site. But no, I mean, look, I think on this point, very simply, people are saying that the world isn't disintegrating or unintegrating, but it is. We're just seeing the initial phases of that. The 2010s was defined by an anti-globalist movement, an anti-globalization movement, COVID, World Economic Forum, neoliberalism, all these terms associated with why multipolarity is so popular. BRICS is so popular because it represents a rejection of the Western or US-led order and approach to sort of foreign policy and building society. But as we say, we need to, and we're seeing the efforts to decouple, to de-risk, friendshoring, nearshoring. All these terms and concepts are pretentious ways of just saying that, you know, the United States and China are always going to be integrated. Their two biggest economies cannot not be, but they're trying to limit how much they can be or protect themselves in certain areas. And that is a reversal, or at least a rejection, of what globalization is. Globalization is the continued, evolution of systems and processes where barriers to trade, to culture, to movement are increasingly reduced. And we're not seeing that. The European Union in the past 10 years has surged. There's a fantastic article in The Economist just yesterday, the day before, which talk about how hardline the European Union has become against immigration. Not on everything, but on immigration, they've tapped firmly to the right. And I think that's a very interesting aspect. Immigration is an absolute reflection of globalization. And we're seeing a reversal of that. So that's what I'd say to people who are countering. But as to the great power competition thing, I mean, in my opinion, I think that certain countries have certain things that they can offer, and power is not a monolithic thing. There are different areas. Like some people consider, I don't know, the Swiss a diplomatic power because they are very good at engaging, peacetime, or Qatar is a diplomatic power because they're the negotiators. You have it's called niche diplomacy for people watching who aren't familiar, perhaps. The Italians are incredibly good at food diplomacy because everything's Italian and food and delicious. But anyway, sorry, David, I know you wanted to jump in.
Well, I think that, one of the things you're seeing I should mention here is, the public does have some voice in this, at least one would hope they do. I think the public in the United States, certainly, and I think elsewhere as well, is becoming tired of war. And this was a major theme, I would say, in the rise of Donald Trump, in that he, amongst other things, presented himself as anti-war. And he criticized the Democrats for being excessively pro-war. And I remember that, Liz Cheney, the daughter of Richard Cheney, strongly endorsed Kamala Harris, and he was very critical of that. He called her a radical war hawk. He used a lot of language, by the way, that was reminiscent of the anti-war left, as ironic as that might seem. There's no doubt that's one of the reasons, that one of his sources of support is the public was moving in that direction. I think that the Americans are very nationalistic, but I think that we collectively had realized the costs of war, the damage the war on terror did to the United States domestically. For what it's worth, I teach in Southern Arizona. I get a lot of military and former military personnel in my class, and I've seen how bitter and angry a lot of returning military personnel were about their experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan. I suspect that the kind of bitterness I saw in my classes, I think a lot of that translated into the Make America Great Again movement, which is, it means America first, make America great, all that. It means many different things. Very flexible definition. One of the things I think it means is spending less money on overseas wars and more money domestically on raising living standards. Needless to say, Trump has gone completely against all of that, has become at least as warlike as any other president that we've had. And he's completely broken with any promises he made about being an anti-war president. Why he's done that is another matter, and we can go into that in another discussion, but he has done that. But I think what is very important to emphasize is there's definitely an element in the American electorate, a large element, which is turning very strongly anti-war. And again, it used to be this was on the left, but now we're seeing it on the right as well. And I think that is going to have a significant impact electorally in the United States. And it may very well change U.S. policy and make it more difficult than in the past to launch these kinds of aggressive wars overseas. Guns versus butter. And I think people increasingly would prefer butter.
That's one way to put it. But David, I guess to bring it back to the original discussion point, I'm just checking if there's any other major updates. Not seemingly right now. We're just going to have to wait to see what comes out. But what do you think? Are we going to see this deal signed? And if not, why not?
It could go either way. Obviously, as John Mearsheimer said, it's been a bit of a roller coaster with what's been going on. And I think the roller coaster, Trump is completely fickle. He could change his mind just like that. And he could just impulsively decide on another attack, or he could decide basically to just walk away from the conflict, or he could decide on a kind of fig leaf of an agreement that is nevertheless a defeat for him. He could do any of these options. And so I'd be reluctant to make any predictions. My hope is that he finds some way of walking away from this conflict, because it's been so destructive and will likely become increasingly destructive to the world economy. But there's no guarantee of that, because to do so for Trump would mean accepting humiliation. And that seems to be something he does not want to do. So I don't really have a clear prediction on that. What would be your prediction, Pyotr? Do you want to hazard a prediction?
We've been through this so many times. If I'm honest, David, when this whole process began, process of war, I sort of assumed that these sorts of things, based on my experience of Middle Eastern exchanges, of course, though they're each is different, and this is the first time we've seen a war of this scale with the Iranians and Americans. It's D-Day, or not, 0 hour for many people, right? This was the thing that people have been planning for, imagining for decades. I thought it would sort of wrap by maybe April, May. The aerial campaign and the intensity of the first month of March was not possible, mainly because the Americans don't have that amount of stockpile, but also because they're split quite thinly. But also that's just because a war of this nature, which is largely indirect, right? It's not like Ukraine and Russia where they're directly next to each other. It makes an aerial campaign very difficult to sustain, and you never get regime change through just war campaigns, from aerial campaigns. So I would like to think that this is it, at least for signing the MOU. I'm going to be very clear that I'm not saying that this is the end of any and all potential flare-ups. I think we could see potential strikes, but I think there's a genuine intent in this regard to get this over the line now. The Iranian IRGC I've just seen have posted something saying that, we will never get a nuclear weapon, or we're not intending to get a nuclear weapon, but we will retain absolute military control over the Strait of Hormuz. And I think that goes back to what I was sort of alluding to earlier in my question to you, which is simply, I think the Iranians have learned that they don't have to be all in on the nuclear warhead card. They have more cards that they can play, and the ultimate one, their joker, if you like, is the Strait of Hormuz. I think it's really given them a strategic reconsideration or clarity on that. And so I think, I hope that we will see this signed, but that definitely does not mean an end to any of this completely. One worries that in a few months' time, we'll just be in the same position, because what triggered all this, it was Trump being fed up, pissed off with the lack of peace talk progress over the nuclear file in February. And so after the persuasion and encouragement by Netanyahu, he's like, yeah, sure, let's go. Screw it. Let's bomb them. We know where they're going to be. We'll take them all out, and decapitation strategy, and they'll capitulate and they'll collapse, and we'll have happy days, chicken dinner or whatever the expression is, right? And we'll go home. I just worry that we'll sort of we'll just have deja vu in sort of September or October and be like, wait, Trump's getting pissed off again. The talks haven't gotten anywhere. Oh no, he's not going to do it, is he? And the only difference might be the midterms. But I don't know. Does that make sense to you? Do you think?
I think what you're saying is somewhat similar to what I'm saying. Is it could go either way.
Yeah. Well, David, it's been an absolute pleasure. Always really enjoy our conversations, and we'll definitely have to have you back. Maybe next week, as we said, I'd like to have a deeper dive about the world order and something. So everyone, keep a lookout for that. We'll talk about it offline, David. But everyone for watching, thanks so much. Have a good evening, weekend, and hopefully positive lines. Enjoy the football, and of course, look out for that video about China, US, and economics coming up later on today.
Very good.